Okay, perfect. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Hope y'all are doing well, counting down to Election Day. My name is Hillary Allen. I work in the Office of Alumni Relations at Meredith and appreciate y'all joining us for this virtual event. We are excited to have Dr. Mitchell Brown with us this evening. She is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Auburn University, and also an associate editor of the Journal of Political Science Education. Mitchell recently co-authored a book along with Kathleen Hale titled How We Vote about the Innovation in American Elections. She's going to talk a little bit more about that book and her research this evening, which I told her earlier when we logged on that it's so timely to have her offer us this information right now as we head into the final days of our upcoming election. So I'm going to turn things over to Mitchell, and I just want to thank you again for being here with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Hillary. I appreciate y'all having me. I am very happy to be here. I'm going to take just a few minutes to do a brief overview of what we did in the book, what motivated it, and some of the things that we found. I'll try and top line it and not get too much in the details. And please excuse my dog. And then we can just have some discussion and question and answer if folks have questions or things they want to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen, and that's always a trick, right? And now I need to start. All right. So the title of the book is How We Vote. And I will tell you that what we did in this book is my co-author and I, Kathleen Hale, have spent the last decade or so working with election officials around the country, doing research about how elections are run and doing training with election officials. And we've been to hundreds of election offices and observed elections and met with, trained, interviewed, discussed things with literally thousands of election officials. And in 2016, during the Russian misinformation, disinformation campaigns and concerns about cybersecurity, and some of the narrative about elections and election administration started changing and became really negative about what's happening in the country and about essentially the quality of our democracy because of the quality of how elections are run. And Kathleen and I felt that a lot of that narrative didn't really match what we were seeing in election offices. And we decided then that we wanted to go about really studying this with a focus on innovation and that how that happened or how it didn't happen. So we spent literally the last 4 years studying this, doing interviews, observing offices, looking at political processes related to elections. And one of the things that we came up with as we were doing this was we developed what we refer to as our innovation theory of change. You see a picture of it here. It takes into account a lot of the parts of thinking about government and how good government works and the things that are necessary for innovation to happen in government. Things like cooperation, governance, collaboration, all set within bigger, broader issues around complexity, interdependence, accountability, and the role of politics in this to really try and get at what was driving innovation in some places, but stifling it in others. So throughout the book, then, we have this model of innovation that we use where we look at within the context of each state, the politics in that state and what's going on politically, the demands on the system, the resources that are available, and the professionalism of the election administrators themselves to try and understand where innovation's happening and where it's not. And so we do this then throughout a couple areas. You see them here on the screen. We look at registration processes and access to elections, convenience voting methods, language, counting, certification, and auditing, equipment and security, and then measurement issues. I will say we did all of this pre-pandemic, and so we see some changes, but some of the things that we see happening where people are able to innovate and make changes and where they're not doing that are pretty predictable from the other things. So to top line some of our big findings here, in terms of politics, one of the big both drivers and stiflers of innovation is about partisan politics within the states. You would expect that going into it. It was absolutely true. The role of professionalism was particularly important. The influence of the kinds of professional networks that people were part of really was a big predictor of some of the things that happened. The partner organizations and how folks collaborate were pretty important. In terms of resources, one of the big things that came to the forefront was about the role of the private sector. And that's become particularly true during the pandemic as we see new private money entering into election administration in ways that it never has before. We also see as one of the things that really stifles innovation is about resources and what resources are available or not to local election officials. And finally, in terms of demands, one of the most important things was about demands on the system from outdated equipment, outdated systems, particularly given concerns about cybersecurity. I will say one of the other big things that comes out of this book and what we talk about is about really a changing landscape and shifts in power in election administration. Election administration has in the United States historically been a hyper local function where local offices really were the drivers of everything. And while they're still in terms of implementation central, we see over the last 20 years some real changes. So well, I'll say 30 years, starting with NVRA in 1993. This is sometimes what people refer to as motor voter. We start seeing some different kinds of arrangements that come about because of the requirement that human service agencies get involved with providing voter registration forms. Then after the 2000 election, when the Help America Vote Act was passed in response in 2002, we start seeing a greater role and authority of state governments in this, in really making localities do some things that they'd never done before. We see a little bit more of this with cybersecurity, with funding from the CARES Act and things like that. The other part that we start to see then is a shift about federal power. So after the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1964. The federal level gets a lot more power. And then after the 2013, when the Shelby v. Holder case was decided by the Supreme Court, which ended a practice called preclearance, which had the Department of Justice making approvals for any local level changes in states or localities that were identified in the development of the VRA as being involved in a lot of voter suppression. With that Shelby case and the end of preclearance, then we see a decline in federal power, an increase a little bit in local authority rather, but certainly some more in state authority. And so this is all a story about complexity too. So the last thing I want to show you is I brought 3 examples from the book that tell a story and some brief graphics about how complex these systems are. The first is about voter registration, then related to that change of address, and then mail balloting. So what we've done in this first example that you see here is we've created a composite view of the registration process. And so what you see on the top of the screen is the different ways that people can be registered in particular states. What we don't have up here is AVR, automatic voter registration, though that's a thing that's coming in a couple of places. So you get then the individual involved. You can have local offices or state offices or nonprofit third-party groups or these other agencies, the human service agencies. All of that then gets sent to the local election official, what we have labeled here as the LEO, who determines eligibility. Once that's determined and voter files are created, then that's fed into a statewide system, which is then fed back again to the local system, either through electronic poll books or paper poll books, depending on the rules of the state and the amount of resources that are available. And then there's this constant maintenance and cleaning process that happens and exchanges with other states to do that. These are groups are called ERIC, or Interstate Crosscheck. And then related to this is the National Change of Address form. So a piece of this, so we just saw that registration process, right? One tiny piece in that whole thing was change of address. And so within this, we've got something like 40 million movers in the United States a year. And every time somebody moves, then because their local jurisdiction where they're voting is likely to move, and the kinds of precincting that gets involved if you're doing in-person voting, then there's this whole other complex process that then is engaged about changing that person's address, whether they initiate that or the change of address card is sent in, or if you're in a state where they have sharing within the state through the election system. And so we've got this other complex process for updating with change of address. And then the last one I'll show you is about mail ballots. And this is particularly timely because of the pandemic. We're seeing a lot more early voting, mail voting, where these things are allowable by state law. And so there are a lot of moving pieces in mail balloting. And again, this is a composite. And what you see here is that there are a lot of different actors involved in this. You've got the voter, and there are different ways requests for a mail ballot can be made, or in some places they don't need to be made at all. They're just automatically sent. Postal Service is involved in this. There's a lot of politics going on right now with the Postal Service. Then the election officials get involved. There's this processing, delivery. When the voter gets their mail ballot, if they get their mail ballot, they can ignore it, they can lose it, they can forget about it. It can be lost in the mail, or they can get it and they can vote it, and then they have to return it. We're seeing a lot of controversy on how you return it, and when you can return it by, and when it's received, whether it's counted or not. And so all of these systems and these subsystems are really interconnected and really complex. And these are just three of 30 or 40 different subsystems involved in election administration. So I want to stop here. A lot of things that we can talk about. One of the big questions that I get when I do these is, isn't the solution to this to go to a national system? I'll tell you off the bat, I don't think that's, I don't think it's going to happen, and I don't think it's the best solution either, but we can talk about that. And I want to just open it up and see if anybody has questions or anything they want to talk about. And thank you again. And I need to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Why is this complicated? Can you make it go away for me, Hillary?
I'm looking to see if I can do that as well.
You know, I teach on Zoom. You'd think I'd figure out how to do this.
You would think we would all be experts.
Here we go.
At
Got
this
it.
point. There we go. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm not a Zoom expert yet. I am curious about why you think that a national method in which we vote might. I mean, I would never think it would work because you've got to get all these states to sign on, and I don't think that would be possible. But why do you think that wouldn't be the best way to do
well,
it?
one of the reasons you've just articulated, right? It would require a constitutional amendment. People who study constitutional amendments can tell you that there have been over 10,000 proposed in Congress since the start of the country, and we've gotten 18 of them passed, right? And so the likelihood of this is really low. Elections are really under-resourced. One of the things that we looked at in our research has been trying to figure out basically how much is spent on elections, and looking at, I think we've got 8 or 9 different states, data at the county level or jurisdiction level in those states, that on average, a county will spend 0.5% of the county budget on running elections. And elections aren't just things that happen once a year. There's constant work in it. And they're, so that it's already this under-resourced thing. And the idea that the federal government's going to take it over and do it better and get into all of these local processes, I think is really unrealistic. I'd also say that I think what we see from other policy areas is when you have national takeover of something and streamlining, it actually stifles innovation. It inhibits the ability of local offices to respond to local needs. It might help some really under-resourced areas, right? Because you have a different spread of funding around, but in general, I think it would stifle innovation. It would then stifle the ability to respond to the local context. And I actually think that one of the things that makes our system slightly more secure than people believe is that it is so different even within states. The idea that you could essentially hack an entire election system in a country and change the results, it's just not real at all. You could potentially, if you put all of your energy into big cities where there are lots of right in a purple area, I could see that, but across the country, no way. It's far too complicated for that.
Okay, it looks like we've got a question from Sherry in the chat. Don't other states besides North Carolina do change of address through the DMV for both voter registration and their driver's license or state ID? She said she recently did this for her mother-in-law and that it worked well.
Yeah, so all the states do. This is one of the things I was talking about the human service agencies and the National Voter Registration Act in 1993. So what we get in 93 is a requirement, and it's why people call it motor voter, that if you're interacting with a human service agency, that part of what they do is they give you a form for voter registration for updating your address. And then the Human Service Agency sends that along to the local election office where it's supposed to go. And so, yeah, you can do this through the DMV. One of the problems that happens with this, well, I guess there are two problems that happen with this. It's not just the DMV. Any human service agency can do this. So imagine you're going in to apply for some kind of public assistance for something, right? Among the stack of papers you get or electronic forms you need to fill out is also a voter registration form. And so some of the I'll call it fear mongering out there about people who aren't eligible to vote, either because they're in a state with felon disenfranchisement rules or because they're non-citizens. Filling out these forms will sometimes accidentally fill them out because they're part of a big set of forms. The other problem that happens is that folks will fill them out, but they'll fill them out incomplete. And so those get then sent to the local election office, and the local election office will then have to track down the people to the extent that they can to get the complete information. And then they'll contact a person and they'll say, well, I didn't want to register to vote. It's just one of the forms in my pile. And so it has been a great process in some ways, and it's challenged the system in other ways.
I have a follow-up question. So I'm wondering about this particular election, given that we've had so many early voters, but we are already seeing such a large number of absentee ballots. And I mentioned when we got on the call that North Carolina, we recently had the Supreme Court case this week. They're now saying we can accept the ballots after November 3rd. Everything was supposed to be in by then. I think we are now going to be able to accept any ballots received as long as they're postmarked by November 3rd through the 12th. Given that there's going to be some inconsistencies from state to state with, are you accepting ballots till the 12th, the 3rd, et cetera? I mean, do you think that opens up some more wiggle room for this possibly being decided in courts?
Rather than I think the biggest threat right now to this particular election that people should be worried about is that it's our court systems who are going to decide who the next president is, or your senator or your congressman or whatever, and not the voters themselves. But on the other hand, I will tell you that having differences across the states not new. We have so part of what this conversation about is something that folks don't really think about very much. When elections are called on election night in the media, it doesn't mean that because the media is called a winner that person's actually the winner, right? Who's the winner isn't finally determined until the election results have been certified in that state. And the certification period in each of the states are really different. This is up to state law. What happens during certification is pretty similar, right? So we have things after the Help America Vote Act was passed called a provisional ballot. So if you think you should be on the rolls and you go to vote and your name's not there, and they can't figure it out in real time, you then can cast this provisional ballot. If you're in a state where an ID is required, right, but you forget your ID, and you can cast a provisional ballot. And then in whatever what's called a cure period is, then you can go back and provide the copy of your ID, and your ballot's then counted, right? And so this period for certification, where all of the curing of these ballots happens, where the mail ballots are counted, if they're, because there are some states that say if it's postmarked by the election day and received within 3 days or 7 days, we'll still count it, process it, and count it. That period differs across the states. So the shortest period that we have in the country is 2 days. The longest explicit period that we have in the country is a couple states that give 3 weeks for this, but there are also a handful of states that don't give a period for certification. They just say certification happens when they're done processing all the ballots, no matter how long it takes, right? And so there's this wide variance in how long that is, though in most states it's about 7 days, 7 to 8 days. And so there's already a real difference here. And it means then, because there's a real difference, we might know in terms of the Electoral College what some states are, depending on when their certification period ends. But there are others that will take a while. And so, yeah, this is another reason why we're likely to see some court challenges. But there are lots of reasons we're going to see court challenges.
Oh, yeah, Sherry said that. Having the new Supreme Court decide the winner, is a fear. When you just mentioned that there might be some other challenges, what do you think might be some of the other challenges that will go into the courts?
Well, I think some of the narrative about I'm losing my words here. The narrative about voter fraud would be another way that people might bring some challenges. Obviously, the differences in the mail balloting and the narrative out there about mail balloting not being safe, but and all mail balloting being a problem, but absentee balloting that happens through the mail is okay, right? So those are areas where we'll see some challenges. My guess is that if there are any problems at the polls and hours have to be extended, which is something that happens in every election, not all the time, but it happens, here or there, something will happen. You get a court order, you extend the hours for voting on election day. We've even had some elections where the day itself has been changed. One of the things people don't ever think about, though, is true, is that 9/11 was actually an election day in New York City for a primary, and they had to change the date of the primary because of it. And so these things can happen. And so to the extent that you get any kind of anomalies in the system, it then provides an opportunity for somebody to file a court challenge. I will say that one of the things that election officials do is that they prepare well in advance for all of these different little anomalies that can happen. And so they have something called continuity of operations plans, or COOPs, that are then used to help them figure out what to do when these things happen. And so they're prepared. And so elections take place under all kinds of circumstances, hurricanes, physical threat. There are a couple places in the country where they've had to close down polling locations because of bomb threats and things like that. These things happen.
I could ask questions all night, but I won't. So I'll see if other folks have questions. If not, I definitely, this is so fascinating to me. This is definitely a side that we often don't discuss when we talk about the elections, and just seeing some of those charts, it is, you can see how it gets really sticky and really confusing very
Yeah,
fast,
the inside of this is really messy, and all the states are different.
which is wild. That is wild. Um, I do have a question because you mentioned it with the ID in order to vote, and that's something that we've gone sort of back and forth with in North Carolina. Is do you need to show an ID in order to vote? You know, this election we're not having to do that. How many states have that law where you have to? Do you know? I mean,
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. One of the things that did happen with the voter ID laws, though, is that after preclearance ended with the Shelby v. Holder decision in 2013, that's when states really started doing that. Right, there were states that had been trying to do that. There were arguments against it that, so the argument for it is that it helps protect the integrity of the election, right? So you make sure that the person casting the ballot is who they say they are, right? The argument against it is that it leads to voter suppression because it creates a greater hardship for people in trying to cast a ballot. I think that the evidence so far suggests that a lot of this is really partisan posturing on both sides, right? There aren't that many cases of substantiated voter fraud. And there aren't that many cases where people are denied the franchise because they can't get an ID. Because in the ID states, what they've done is they've created essentially free voter IDs, right? That you can get them for free. The threshold often for getting them is that you sign an affidavit saying that you are who you say you are, that you were born when you say you were born, and that you're a U.S. citizen. And so I think a lot of the fighting over this has just been about politics as opposed to about real problems. Now, that having said, anybody who's eligible to cast a ballot should be able to, no matter what. Well, as long as they're within the rules, right?
any other questions from the group? Okay,
My roommate better ask a question.
okay, yeah, okay, Jennifer, you've got to ask. So Jennifer needs to start thinking of a question. I will say this election, I think, has taught us a lot more about the Board of Elections and how they function, and that you're appointed, specifically in North Carolina. Oh, she says she's so proud of you, Rumi. That's very sweet. But she needs to be thinking of a question. But in North Carolina, the governor appoints it. It's 5 total or 4 total, I think. The governor gets to appoint folks from his part. No, it's three from his party and then 2 from the other party. I truly did not have a grasp and understanding of how all this functions. Is every state set up like that?
No. Every state's different. One of the differences that you see across the states is how many different offices are involved in elections. So you all essentially have one office that runs elections per county. In some places, it's not the county level. In some places, it's like a township level, a city level. In some places, there are multiple offices that are involved in running different functions of elections. Usually when it's multiple, it's 2. The state I'm in has the most of any in the country. In each county, we have 5 different offices that get involved in running the elections and how they're run. And so there are different, the functions of running an election are parsed out across those 5 offices, and they have to coordinate together to make it happen. And then who's in charge of that also differs. So in some states, you have people who run for it. It's an elected office itself to be the local election official in charge of that office, which makes it necessarily partisan, right? Because you end up affiliating with a party. In some places, you have boards. They might be bipartisan boards. In some places, the boards are not equally distributed, like North Carolina. So the governor in charge then gets to appoint the 3rd person, right, from that party. So there's a real different kind of array of how this is done. I will say that I have, again, I've worked with so many different election officials, and whether they're appointed or elected, whether they're partisan or nonpartisan, I think for the most part, almost every single one of them just wants to do a good job, and they're not trying to use their position to influence an outcome in any possible way. So that's something I'm not particularly worried about.
That's good. I do think in North Carolina this year, I saw a little bit more how you can politicize the Board of Elections. And I don't know that I think that's appropriate, right? But I mean, I definitely thought, oh, that is interesting. I
Well, it's
never
a good
realized it.
question, but the whole point of elections is political, right? And we've got a political system and a two-party system with two parties, and that the idea that they fight with each other over who has the most power and use that power to influence things, that's probably real, right? Look at the fights over partisan gerrymandering when we redraw districts every 10 years after the census, right? Who runs the state legislatures across the country based off of this election right now is going to set the tone and a lot of what happens for the next decade, right? This election is critical for a whole lot of reasons, right? It's critical because we've got an incumbent president who's divisive, whether you love him or hate him, right? And it's an important election because it's unprecedented with foreign intrusion continuing to happen as a holdover from the 2016 election, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, because we're fighting over all these rules, and we've been fighting for a while now. And the partisan rhetoric is about elections and what the election rules are is worse than it's ever been, probably. Well, I won't say ever. There have been some pretty exciting times in elections and the politics of elections, but more than 100 years ago.
Let's see. Okay, I think Sherry has another question in the chat. Because of COVID and the amount of people 65 plus volunteering at the polls, and now being afraid to do so, do you think there's going to be a shortage of poll workers this year, which might be longer lines at the polls, or you don't know what that impact could be?
Yeah, so the expectation is that there'll be a shortage, right? Because most poll workers tend to be older, and there are lots of reasons for that that make a lot of sense. One of the problems and the drawbacks with that, though, has been historically been about technology, and now because of the pandemic, the states have been doing things to try and mitigate the effects of that on election day, like expanding vote by mail, right? And so the hope is, and we've certainly seen just a huge amount of ballots cast already in a way we've never seen before. And so in those states where they're doing that, the expectation then is it'll mean that, obviously there are going to be fewer people to turn out polls. And so hopefully that'll have a positive effect on the lines. Though I would say that long lines isn't necessarily a problem. It's not indicative that something's gone wrong with the administrative process. It might be, right? But it also might be indicative that people are really excited to be there and to vote. And, we wait for all kinds of things. Why can't we wait to cast a ballot? One of the other things that we'll see, though, is you'll see pictures of lines that will look unusually long because of the physical distancing requirements that we have, right? And the other thing that turns out to be really important is how those pictures are taken. So you can make a line look longer depending on the angle that you use to take the picture. And so I think one of the things that people have to be really careful about is how they interpret what they're watching in the media, and what the motivations of, whether it's social media posts or television, or even newspaper stories, what the motivation of the person doing the posting is, right?
Sure. Based on what you're seeing right now, Mitchell, I mean, we're seeing large volumes in North Carolina, and I'm sure you're watching, obviously Alabama, but other states. Do you think that this might be the largest voter turnout we've seen in an election, or do you think they all voted
I
early,
think it'll be,
mail-in ballots?
yeah, I think it'll be a big one. We saw huge turnout, particularly from some groups that tend not to turn out quite as high. in 2008, right? That was a big turnout year. And so my guess is, yeah, we're going to see a lot of turnout, and all the evidence so far supports that, right? Maybe on election day, nobody will be there. I can't believe that, right? I'll be there.
Me too.
I'm excited. I'm going to pack my snacks and a chair. So, it's going to be great.
Right. I am I am an election day voter. I can't mail it in. I can't go early. Everybody I know has gone early, but I have to go on election day. It just
Yeah,
something
I agree. I
feels,
love election day,
yeah,
but
it just feels right.
and I get mail voting, and I get states that have gone to it and why they do it. It turns out over time to be more cost effective and more efficient. But I love going to the polls. So
Me too. Yeah.
great.
Old fashioned in that way, I guess. No,
Yeah,
no surprise. I
yeah.
still read the paper and I still read books. So let's see. Any questions from the group? Has Jennifer thought of her question yet?
No, she's a punk. Right, right. Yes, everybody who's eligible to vote should come cast their ballot. Um,
Oh, good.
yes, read my book. It's very exciting. Here,
Good.
I'm going to see if I
Good.
have a copy right here. Read it. It's delightful. Right.
That's amazing. I can't believe, what did you say? It was 10 years of research that went into it?
No, this one was 2016 we
Okay.
started.
Okay.
We've been working on this for a little over 10 years together,
Okay.
Kathleen and
Wow.
I have been doing
Wow.
research on that. Yeah.
That's amazing. Goodness. But
Yeah.
what did it feel like to finally get it into print then?
Oh, I'm always, this is my fifth book, and I'm always very unhappy when the final version goes in, because I want more time to make them better. And then if I make the mistake of opening them and reading them, often I'll be like, oh, there's a mistake on page
Oh, no.
64, right? And so I sort of hate that. Someday I'm going to write a book, and when I send it to the publisher, the final version, I'm going to be completely delighted by it and think it's the best thing I've ever written, and that will be the last book I write.
Okay. That sounds like a good goal to have then.
Yes.
Okay, if I'm not seeing any questions, I'm going to ask one final question. Out of all of the different precincts and elections, yeah, you said you've worked with several counties, states. Who do you think has it figured out? Who has the best model that we should all model?
Oh, that's not a fair question. There are lots
Is
of
it not?
places doing really good things. I would say, there are lots of really great election officials everywhere, and I know a lot of them. One of my favorite in North Carolina is a guy in Forsyth County named Tim Suji, and I think he does a great job. A really smart guy, and has done a lot of innovation in that office. I can name people in almost every state. We don't spend a lot of time up in the Northeast, the smaller states, but there are a lot of great things. One of the neat things going on right now for the past few years has been out in LA County, where they've created their own homegrown election system and put out a bid for a vendor to pick it up. And they worked with people to do that. And the system they created is really smart. And the guy who runs that office is named Dean Logan, and just did a great job of that. It's not like all things, it's not been without controversy and not been without problems, but there are just really smart people all over the country who are, for the most part, really underpaid and really overworked running our elections.
Hmm. Yeah, this is so fascinating. I'm glad we were able to hear more about your research, because I do think this is a side that we often don't address when we talk about politics or just the election process, but obviously very important, and has definitely evolved over the years. I mean, it's the hallmark of our democracy, so it's nice that that is something that's going to continue to evolve. And for those of you that haven't voted, please make sure you do so, or you can be like Mitchell and myself, and we'll be there on election day next Tuesday. I will say, if y'all have any other questions, now is a good time to ask them. I apologize if I asked all the questions tonight. This is just so fascinating to me. I'm so curious about things like this. I was also a politics major at Meredith, so maybe that maybe that explains part of it as
Yeah.
well. No,
We had great professors, and there
well,
are still great professors in the department, right?
there are, yeah. I mean, I'll put a plug in for David McLennan, Dr. David McLennan, who runs the Meredith poll on campus. Our students have a polling function that they do from campus and get paid to do this for outside organizations. He's going to be on C-SPAN tomorrow morning talking about the significance of the election in North Carolina and particularly our Senate race, because we have a very contested Senate race this year as well. So, oh, good. Yeah. Okay. Great, Sherry. I'm glad you enjoyed the discussion. But so yes, keep a lookout. He will be there 8:45 a.m. Eastern time on C-SPAN talking about North Carolina. I mean, we're definitely one of those states to watch this year, which is fascinating. So, Mitchell, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. This was wonderful. I have recorded this, so I will send it out. Encourage y'all to. Okay, Sherry was a poli-sci major as well. Okay, lots of former politics majors all together on the Zoom tonight. That's great. I will send this out to each of you, and we'll make sure we post it on our Facebook group as well, because we have our own little YouTube channel that we've been putting our virtual events on. So I want to thank you so much for your time. Great hearing your research. Great not only to hear your research, but to also be able to support and promote one of our own. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to see some familiar names. And if I ever get to do this again, Jennifer, you're asking the question.
Okay, we're gonna put that in the minutes then. Thank you again. Hope everybody has voted or has a plan to vote. And I hope y'all have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.